Boom, ladies and gentlemen, indeed, boom. And this is hopefully going to be the last time I visit that little well of for the moment, for sport and trans women, intersex athletes in sport and all that jazz. I want to move back into more traditional territory for my channels, but let's just stick this on the B channel, hence the boom at the beginning. Because Suris the Skeptic made a video, an interesting video on this subject that I wanted to respond to. And I wanted to respond to it because it went down some of the same lines that I went down. There were some similarities, some commonalities, but then some points of divergence, which I think are actually quite large divergences. And so this is unscripted, this video, and I'll finish the video and there'll be a couple of key points that I wanted to make that I won't make, but I'll get some of it off my chest, and after all, that is part of why one runs a YouTube video channel, I should say. So the points of agreement were that, as Suris said in the video, they see worth in having an open category and a protected category. Duly, therefore, they understand that functionally the women's/female category is a protected category and the men's/male category is not. So we agree thus far. We also agree on the fact that gender is a spectacularly irrelevant metric upon which to differentiate sport. It makes no difference. Gender identity makes no difference to sporting success. So we agree on that. Where we started to disagree, to diverge, is that I then went to the source, as I see it, which is that effectively the protected category, let's call a spade, shall we? Yes, I think we shall. The protected category will be judged upon the inclusion of females, biologically female humans, because that is the group in this instance that we see as going to be disenfranchised. 51% of the population, ladies and gentlemen, disenfranchised by elite sport without some form of protection. So therefore we have some form of protected category, just as we do with age banding for people of 18 and under, sometimes 21 and under, 40 and over in masters and veterans categories, progressing through the age banding in some sports, and weight categories in some sport. Mirroring those kind of approaches, because we see those groups as needing some kind of ring fencing if they're going to be able to have competition. So I thought, let's go straight to the source. If it's female people that you want to ring fence, let's ring fence female people. I understand why Suris doesn't want to do that, because Suris sees, well, it's all contentious, and then we get in the business of some trans people not liking them not being regarded as female, and they're still going to feel like they're not competing with cis women and blah de blah de blah. So I understand that. The problem is that you end up in a minefield immediately. You end up quagmired down. One of the reasons is because for our sporting categories to work, we need what is termed meaningful competition. And unfortunately, some people distill meaningful competition down into only one of the factors. And the factor they distill it down into is closeness of abilities. Right, if you can get the ability close enough, then that gives you meaningful competition. But that is, I'm afraid, only half the game. Meaningful competition benefits from closeness of outcome, but only if you're comparing, only if it's a kind of apples comparison. That's why something like an over 60s comparison category works, because it gives you closer competition than 60-year-olds competing in an open category against 20 and 30-year-olds, but also because it feels like a meaningful category for us. We're comparing 60-year-olds with other 60-year-olds. Not all categories that close the competition down are meaningful in the same way. If I was to conduct an 800 meters race with somebody and they're running and I'm on my bike, I will win. You could start to tighten my brakes up so that the blocks are binding on the rim, and you would reach a point duly whereupon my speed would be slowed down to the point where my times would be the same as an 800 meters runner of a similar amount of training running with me on my bike biking. Okay, but that would not be meaningful. Nobody would watch that event and gain any meaning from that. One of the reasons is because we're doing different things. It doesn't seem like an apples versus apples comparison. And two is because we've introduced an extra level of arbitrariness, and that's a key to all these things here. And that extra level of arbitrariness is how tightly my brakes have been tightened. So if I win, is it because I'm a better athlete, or is it really because my brakes should have been tightened a little bit more there? And that's the problem anytime you don't have an apples versus apples comparison in sport. And this is the problem that you're going to get into as soon as you start having these categories that Suris wants in any sport which is a function of more than one physiological variable, as most sports are. Once you start creating that protected category in terms of those physiological variables, rather than this kind of generalized thing of femaleness or age or weight. And it must be noted, it was quite interesting watching Suris's video, is that Suris talked about how we should get away from this irrelevant thing of gender and instead look at the physiological things that matter, and then immediately mentions age banding and weight banding. And yet age banding and weight banding are the same types of approximations for other things, surrogates for other things, as gender or even biological sex is. It's not actually your biological sex, it's things that correspond with biological sex. It's not really age. It's the processes of aging that reduce these physiological metrics in general as you start getting into your 40s, and then a bit more as you get into your 50s. And that is why we create the bands. With weight, it's exactly the same. It's not simply being heavier. Put on another 10 kilos of pure fat and it will not have the same effect as putting on, as just being a 10 kilos heavier person of the same body fat level. Okay, so it's not, these are sort of surrogates for the real things in exactly the same way. And so we end up with a number of problems here. One of the things we end up with is that even in a simple sport, take a sport like basketball, where we all know that height is really, really important. You only need to look at the number of 7-footers in the NBA and then work out the number of 7-footers there must be amongst the male competitive age population in North America to see just how important height is. I'm not even sure that there will be that many 7-footers as there are in the NBA. There's about 40 odd 7-footers in the NBA, and the majority of them, something like 65% or 70% of them, are from outside of the United States, which is a far greater percentage than it is across the rest of the NBA, because being 7 foot is just such a huge advantage there. So obviously the thing that your point of segregation in basketball is going to be height. The problem is, like I say, ultimately, you're going to judge whether this is a success or failure by, in the protected category, whether females are significantly represented. And I'm afraid all you're going to end up with is an open basketball league for exceptionally tall males, and then a protected basketball league for 5'11" and 6 foot males. That's the brutal truth, because even at the same height, male athletes will outperform, and this is the problem. This is always the problem, whether it's boxing, whether it's weightlifting, etc., that even at the same point, even at the same weight point, or even at the same age point, or even whatever it is, that biological males outperform biological females. So then you have to take what would have been an apples versus apples comparison, let's say a weightlifting category for 75 kilos for males and females, everybody, okay? You then have to create an apples versus oranges comparison and then say, okay, well, this category will be for males who are 75 kilos and under and females who are 80 kilos and under. I hope you can see the issues that we have there. They're pretty big issues. Pretty sizable issues. The first is that you now have an apples versus oranges comparison. It doesn't seem a meaningful category anymore. And when we see that the 80 kilo female has won the gold medal at the Olympics in that category, we're left wondering, is that because she was the strongest lifter? Or is it really because it shouldn't have been a 5 kilo gap. It really should have been 75 kilo males against 78 kilo females, and the gap, and if it's always a male that wins, then we'll think, well, maybe that's because the gap's too small and it should have been 82 kilo females. It's suddenly we introduce an element of arbitrariness that we never had before. We seem to have gone away from the apples versus apples comparison that made it meaningful in the first place. So that becomes a real problem there. And this is even in sports. All we're talking about at the moment is sports where we can even do that. Once you start going beyond those sports, then I'm not even sure how you would go about doing that in the first place. And this is why my observation has been that whenever I've heard this kind of suggestion made, that, well, what we need to do is, right, we need to find out what the actual physiological metrics that are important for each sport is and differentiate the sport by them rather than males and females, men and women. And it all sounds so easy, doesn't it? But it's always made by people that have no expertise in sports science and profess no expertise. You will never hear anybody with the expertise in sports science ever make this kind of argument because they cannot just defer it to somebody else. It's like if you hear the argument, well, it's easy how to solve the world's energy crisis. All we need is controlled nuclear fusion reactors, and then we'll have just as much energy as we need for as long as we ever need it. Problem solved. Anybody can make that. Sounds a wonderful solution, doesn't it? Other than the fact it's nowhere near as easy to do as it is to suggest. So you will never hear a nuclear physicist suggest that because they know that this problem so far seems intractable as far as we're concerned. Maybe we'll come up with a solution, but so far they can't come up to it. It's a lot easier to say than it is to do. And you can say it when you can just defer to somebody else's expertise to do what is actually a couple of orders of magnitude harder than the thing you've done to come up with the idea, I would say. If you take a sport like association football, we know that if you put an elite male team versus an elite female team, the elite male team will just flatten them. They'll walk all over them. They'll annihilate them in the game. But why is that? Is it because they've got a greater cardiovascular capacity, more endurance, greater strength endurance? Is it because they've got greater power, greater acceleration? Is it because they're just stronger on the ball? They're more physical? Is it because they're a bit taller, they're a bit bigger? Is it because by having some of these physiological characteristics that whatever pace the game is played at, they are playing within a smaller proportion of their maximum capability, and therefore in any sport, the greater you play within the limits of your capability, the more accurately you can do what you do. As you get closer to that limit, you become a little bit less accurate, a little bit more ragged. Just try hitting a golf ball. If you try and hit it as hard as you can, you won't be as accurate, right? So maybe that is the factor. What I would say is there's probably 7 or 8 factors that are important, physiological factors. You would need to work out what those factors were. And once you've done that, you still haven't begun on the difficult part, which is scaling them relative to one another, and then finding some kind of numerical way in which you can assess individuals. And bear in mind, you can't take fucking muscle autopsies to work out what their type 2A and type 2B muscle fiber percentages are, for crying out loud. So some of the metrics you won't even be able to work out anyway, because it's not something that you could expect an athlete to allow you to do. But even if you could, how you scale them is going to be the most arbitrary thing of all. Way, 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 way more arbitrary than the issue that you were trying to solve in the first place. And so this is why these kinds of ways of doing it are never applied. We just never bother doing it. Not to mention the fact that you end up with categories, which even in those sports where you can create them, the simpler kind of purer sports that you would see perhaps on an athletics field and running track, you end up effectively creating categories that are so obviously second rate that it's hard to bundle them up in terms of some kind of equality. We can do that with men's and women's categories, and to some extent the bluff works because they seem like meaningful categories. If you're the best woman in the world at something, that seems like something meaningful, just the same as if I competed against gorillas at weightlifting, I would lose, but you'd still maybe say, well, if Noel Plum is the best human, that is something meaningful. But once I start competing a category for very powerful human weightlifters and gorillas who aren't particularly good at weightlifting, it doesn't seem meaningful anymore. And it's the same kind of thing here. It's just obvious you're creating some kind of fudge of different disparate groups of people who their only commonality is their same suboptimal, sub-elite level of performance. And that's a big turn-off, I think. Even if you could pull the trick off, and even if you pulled all of that off, you're still going to be judged effectively on whether the ultimate metric upon which it's judged is this category giving the 51% of our populations who are female the chance to excel and win at the most elite level of the sport.